I'm Barry Farber. For years, Sid Bernstein has been suggesting that we do a broadcast on a favorite topic of his. Right now is the time. We're going to. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You'll say, oh, dear me, how can anybody do a radio show about that? Well, Sid Bernstein is the man who brought the Beatles to America. He is an impresario with an unerring eye for commercially successful talent. He thinks he sees some now, but that's an entertainment story, which we'll get to. He has a television show, which is a launching pad for talent, Career on the Line, Channel J, Friday nights at 8:30. And he teaches at the New School for Social Research, and he works out in a gym more successfully than anybody else I know. And for years, in spite of all the real hard things that Sid Bernstein might talk about, he's been saying, hey, Barry, let's do a show on happiness. Yeah, happiness. Now, I know how I feel about abortion. I know how I feel about capital punishment. I know how I feel about communist expansionism. I know how I feel about the pestilential degeneration of our public school system. And I know how I feel about happiness. I'm unalterably in favor of it. But to do a radio program about happiness strikes me like trying to nail a custard pie to the wall. But you can't go wrong when you have people like Sid Bernstein, backed up on the trombone section by attorney Cecile Weich. I'm going to sit back and let you establish the general theme. For over a year since you've been mentioning this, I've been curious to know how you approach it.
I have called you a number of times, Barry. I guess it is about a year, to talk about happiness. It's a change from the daily headlines, the gruesome, the unhappy things we read each day, but there's got to be some good things in our life, in our city, happening out there, and I would just like to switch for change and not get into the heavy, sad stuff, but some of the nice things that one can do, some of the nice things that one can experience in our city, in our country, and particularly here in New York, where we live and where so many people from all over the world and from the 50 states, particularly this summer, come and enjoy the good things that one can have. And the first thing that comes to mind, the very first thing, is those great concerts in Central Park. For example, this coming Monday night, Leonard Bernstein conducts the Philharmonic Orchestra. The Staten Island Ferry, loaded with tourists, enjoying the skyline. I think it's 25 cents or 30 cents, and one can go back and forth and see this great city from a great vantage point and pass the most beautiful lady in the whole world, the Statue of Liberty. Makes one feel good, makes one feel proud. And the cost is within reach of every child, every adult. The great streets of our city, Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue. There's a lot of joy in walking the streets and taking in the great sights. The people who come here from all over the country. The people, friendly people, cameras, looking up at the tall buildings. It gives me a joy to see them enjoying Trump Tower, Empire State, Woolworth Building, Chrysler Building, the parks, the public library. There's so many good things that one can really enjoy. Getting up to the top of the Empire State and looking out for miles on a clear day, it's a good feeling. I enjoy these things, and I've been here all my life. and I've never tired of the good things. Little Italy, Greenwich Village, Soho, Yorkville, Chelsea, Murray Hill. Each neighborhood has its special atmosphere, special people. Chinatown, the Hungarian section in the upper 70s, 80s. Even Hell's Kitchen, where it used to be heavily populated by Irish people, had a very special charm. Harlem, fascinating. Needs change, but fascinating still. The people, interesting, alive. In spite of all the heaviness and sadness, a lot of humor, a lot of song, a lot of music. And the music that comes out of our city. Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center. A great city, and a lot of positive things.
Cecile Weich, prominent matrimonial attorney. I know you hate to strike the down note, but it's your turn.
Well, I liked what Sid said. I thought it was lovely. I thought it was glossy. I thought it was frothy. But the city is decaying underneath all of that froth and gloss. We have a very heavy drug culture that's destroying the youth of our city, not just from the lower classes, but from the middle and upper classes. We have decay in our buildings. Our infrastructure is, again, the word decaying. We don't have the funds, or we as citizens don't make our public officials want to use the funds to repair our city. I think that it's very nice to talk the way Sid has spoken, Barry, but I think that there's more to New York than just the gloss and the froth. And I did think we were going to talk about personal happiness and how that's achieved, as you put it on this planet.
I'm not ruling that out. I just wanted Sid to get us started.
Yeah.
I've been made very happy in the past 10 seconds by the addition of Professor Richard Brown to our panel. More on him momentarily.
I'm not saying that we live in the utopia.
Certainly sounded like that to me, Sid.
No, what I'm saying is there's so much depression, and I said the newspapers are so full of sadness and crime and murder and chaos. There are other things beside that. There are some good things.
Sure, there are good things, but unless we start preserving and protecting those good things, then our children and grandchildren will not have the benefit of the city.
Yeah, true. Again, the note was, and the request to Barry, as he said earlier, was let's talk about happy things that do make us happy. The laughter of a child, children playing in the street is a very happy scene. It means a lot to most of us who love children. That still prevails in the streets. We know there's danger on the streets, and if we're going to talk about doing something about that, let's talk about it. There are a lot of ills in the city, and
we live in a society where the laughter of children is overshadowed by the fact that recently, over the last few years, we've come to understand that the greatest scandal in our country is that of child abuse, of adults abusing children mentally and physically, within and without the family.
Well, what action can you suggest? What do we do besides education? What do we do to?
Well, I think that education is very important. I think it's very nice to have someone like you suggest that our city is so very lovely. Indeed, on the surface, in certain parts of the city, it seems to be. But there are other parts of the city that even when the sun shines, it doesn't shine on the children. There are thousands of children, not just in this city, but throughout the country, that go to bed hungry and wake up hungry. We're not doing anything to alleviate that situation. I mean, most respectfully, Mr. Bernstein, Sid, it's very nice to think about concerts in the park and sunshine on Columbus Avenue and opera, perhaps on Broadway, in the streets. But I think that unless we take some affirmative steps, and I'm not sure what they are. I mean, I have some suggestions, but I think unless we take some affirmative steps to correct some of the ills of our society, we're going to end up without the beauty that you see.
Well, the affirmative steps are taken by people like us. The people take the affirmative steps.
One would think so, but it's not quite that simple.
If there isn't leadership that does it, and generally it is leadership that leads a movement that makes for changes, then the people have to do it. And we have to do it. If we're really concerned, and I guess we are, we've got to take the steps that are necessary to change some of the ugly conditions of our city.
If I were a psychiatrist, I would refuse New York as a patient because New York has not taken the first requisite step in its own cure. New York is still trying to fix blame and blames its condition on some abstraction, and that's nonsense. New York was great until the year 1957. That's the beginning of the decline. In 1957, you could walk through Central Park, you could leave your door unlocked. We didn't know what the word mugging was. I'm not short of ideology right now, but my voice is very, very short. Cecile, I hate to turn my baton over to someone as liberal as you, but go ahead and pick up the theme. You're doing well so
Well, the concept being, I remember that time. It was time when I went to City College in those years, and I was able to walk through the park in Upper Harlem. I was able to go on the subways, a place that I have not permitted my sons, as they were growing up, to go on, because the city did indeed start decaying around the time. Barry, I hate to agree with you. I mean, this is 2 times in a row. This is not going to work. But I do agree with you. I think that our city started decaying at that time, and I think that a lot of the fault lies with what you call us. You know, us. Spans a great deal of territory and people. I agree with Barry. I don't know that if I were a psychiatrist, I would refuse to take New York. I think the challenge,
stop.
the challenge might be interesting.
No. So New York. Did you ever know an alcoholic who is just absolutely rich in excuses for his condition? He can offer forth excuses that touch everything and everybody except himself.
Well, if you are suggesting that we're making excuses as the people of the city of New York for what's happened to the city, perhaps that's so. I think our public officials certainly make a hell of a lot of excuses, and I think that we're all guilty of apathy. Perhaps not those of us who come to the Barry Farber show, but
well, that's a sign of commitment.
Yeah. But a great many of our colleagues in the world are guilty of apathy, and I thought that's what we were going to talk about, Sid. I thought we were going to talk about something like happiness as it relates to apathy, perhaps.
Just let me put in one final caveat about the character of New York. New York admits it's dirty, but it doesn't take the blame for its dirtiness. New York will not face itself in a mirror and say the trouble with New York is New Yorkers. If there are not enough garbage cans and the sanitation department, the cutbacks and the Graham Rudman, this city is a shocking disgrace compared to any other city in the civilized world. You go to a London, as big as New York. You go to a Paris, as busy as New York. And just check not the tortured faces of the people on the London tubes or the Paris metro. They're going to look pretty much like they look in the New York subway, I'd imagine. Just check the filth level, the droppings on the street, the condition, the litter. Just take any square yard of London, Paris, Rome, Budapest, Moscow, Peking, Taipei, any city in the world, whether the regime is of the right or of the left, and you will find that New York has no company. New York is the alcoholic just bellowing forth blame on everything and everybody except itself. I wouldn't take New York as a patient until New York comes to my outer office, meekly gives its name and address and Medicare, Medicaid number to the receptionist, sits down and is prepared to come in and say, the trouble with me is I. New York is not ready to do that. There's just much too much ego.
Okay. We are getting away, and reluctantly, I get into what we're talking, very heavy stuff that we're talking about. I wanted to talk about pleasant stuff, but...
you did for about 90 seconds.
Okay,
and it was beautiful.
I just want to address myself to Cecile, to Cecile. You know, you understand the conditions that are so wrong. What are we doing about it? Here we have Harlem, Spanish Harlem, Black Harlem, Delancey Street, Orchard Street. It's almost like, not quite, like the black hole of Calcutta.
Hold it. Not a bad image for New York to look at itself mirror-wise into. I'm Barry Farber. Good buddy Sid Bernstein wanted to talk about happiness. I don't know how happy it's going to make him, but I'm going to let him. You know, once a friend of mine thought he was being uplifting and making me feel good. He said, Barry, I listened to you the other night. Man, you are really learning how to make your introductions brief and blunt and short and snappy and catchy. I love those short introductions. I used to think you went on and on and on too long. And what he didn't know is that night he was referring to, I had laryngitis. I had laryngitis so bad I couldn't even listen, you know. Now, I feel frustrated right now. I want to talk about Richard Brown and his magnificent work at the New School for Social Research and those auditoria full of students studying the cinematic art. I always like to salute Professor Richard Brown for having invented a whole new kind of business involving the film business. He did not invent writing, he did not invent directing, he did not invent producing, he did not invent special effects, but by golly, he did invent the study of the film as a whole new thing, and he has seen his work become a major part of the film industry nationwide and worldwide, as he will prove before we part company. Sid Bernstein is with me. Try to remember what I said about him last time and just repeat that to yourself now because my voice is going again. Cecile Weich, famous matrimonial attorney. I'm Barry Farber, and I've got a lot of people I genuinely like who are egoistic and will not admit that their faults are their faults. And New York is just another one of my good friends that will not admit its faults because of an ego problem, and I love it anyhow. New York's probably the most important city in the whole world, and it gets so full of its own importance that it will not admit things like it has too much crime, too much filth, education, politics. New York just has very serious problems, and as Sid was talking about the good things of New York, Cecile, I don't think he was denying those problems. I think he was just trying to say, come on, folks, it's not always as bad as it is sometimes. And I must
Well, it's
admit,
nicer in the summertime. What he's doing is walking the streets of New York in the sunshine, and it's harder to see the decay when the sun is shining.
I see the decay, and again, reluctantly, I get away from the subject that I've been torturing Barry with. Let's talk about happiness for one evening, but you've brought us back to reality, and there's a lot of reality and ugly reality about our great city. And I think, as I drive through Spanish Harlem, the Lower East Side, Orchard Street, and the poverty and the neglect, and I think about here in other sections, great buildings, luxurious buildings, apartment buildings, beautiful office buildings, towers. I like our system, democratic capitalist system, but if we're going to preserve it, I get the feeling that we've got to do something for the other part of the city, the part that's decaying, the part that's crumbling.
That's the trouble with our society, because everybody wants to do something for. I think that we've lost the concept of people doing things for themselves. Perhaps that's what Barry is talking about when he says, for goodness sakes, what, Barry?
This reminds me of those jokes. There are 189 jokes that begin the same way. The priest wants to go see his sister in Milwaukee, and he asked the rabbi if he'll come and do Mass for him that Sunday. You're doing my act for me because I had a bad throat.
I know. This is the third time I'm agreeing with her on the show, too. I can't believe it. I'll tell you something.
This is a terrible show, then, if we're all agreeing. Let's pick a topic where we can disagree.
Started his Great Society, where he was going to eliminate poverty. That was the beginning of the end of the quality in this society, because there's always been poverty there, and the more you institute welfare programs, how many years will it take liberal people to understand that for 2 decades we've been putting money into it, and the situation is worse than it's ever been before?
And I keep telling Barry I'm not a liberal because I agree with you, Professor Brown.
Well, then in that case he is to blame then, because
he's to blame for labeling me, because it's not fair to label me or anybody else.
I walk
Barry.
through the city of London, Sid, Cecile, Barry, I walk through, I see gardens, I see flowers, I see beauty. I don't see garbage and trash. You go through a city in London, you go to a garden or a park in London, all these public parks, thousands and thousands of lovely plots of flowers. Where do you find that in New York? Nowhere, because that rose wouldn't last 10 minutes in that garden, as we all know. Somebody would pluck it like that. In Greenwich Village, where I live, we have a beautiful garden near the Jefferson Market. It used to be the site of the Women's House of Detention. It's beautiful. But of course it's fenced in. And you look at the flowers through a fence. Why do you have to have a fence? The same thing we're up in the Sheridan Square area. We've got a gorgeous garden, and there's a fence around it that's 10 feet high. Because if there wasn't a fence, people would destroy it. And right after it would be destroyed, if you caught the people who destroyed it, they'd go into court, and a whole assortment of very liberal judges would come down with 27 reasons to explain a bad home, inadequacy, poverty, a minority group membership, a broker, 27 reasons, fine. But that's beside the point. Because I live in a city in which there are people who are less privileged than me does not mean that I have to live with filth every time I walk on the street, that when I go on a subway I can't see a decent subway car. There's more poverty in London than there is in New York, but they don't destroy their subway cars with spray cans and then have some people call it art. It is not art. It's people who are slowly but surely destroying the quality of my life and the life of everybody who lives in the city. And until you start to say, we're really not going to put up with this, because this is not only the worst city in the world to live in, very likely, it's also the most exciting city. And why is it so exciting? It's exciting for one reason, because of the people. They are sharper, they're brighter, they work harder here. But let me tell you, I live in a city with terrific people, New Yorkers. They're also the worst slobs in the world. And when people come in here from Cincinnati and Toledo and Denver, good, nice people come in to enjoy the city, and they look around and they say, man, I wouldn't live here for all the money in the world.
You know,
I know just what they're talking about.
Can you imagine hearing what I have just heard and having a throat that's too bad to yell and applaud? I admire the wolf. The wolf does something very civilized. When two wolves are fighting for leadership of the pack, the loser at the last instant raises his chin as if to say to the winner, here, you can bite me in the neck and kill me if you want to, but the winner doesn't. It's in human terms, it's like handing over your sword after a battle when you lose. I did that one time. A friend of mine, not from Cincinnati, I wouldn't give my sword to anybody from Cincinnati. He came from Oslo, Norway. City's so clean. In Oslo, you get up in the middle of the night in your hotel room to go to the bathroom, you come back and your bed's made. It is one of the cleanest, most well-kept, ordered cities and societies in the world. My buddy Herman was walking with me through Brooklyn, and it was there were pieces of houses blocking the street. I mean, it really looked like it was after a bombing raid. And I just had to stop, and I turned to him and I said, Herman, what would you do if you were to see this in Oslo? And he didn't say a word, just went over and picked one of the parts of our house out of the street and picked it up and jammed it into the trash can right there and brushed his hands and smiled. And we understood each other. I felt a little bit tension-free until we saw the next outrage a foot and a half down the street. Do I live in fear that Sid Bernstein is going to copy Richard Nixon, hold a press conference and say he's not coming on any more talk programs anymore. Soon we won't have Bernstein to kick around anymore. Can you imagine if Sid Bernstein, this absolutely incandescent liberal, were to remove himself from the public arena? What would we do?
Barry, I want to tell you about Richard Nixon. There was a time when I really enjoyed him. I think it was his first comeback after being deposed as president. He was speaking to the Oxford Student Union. It was an incredible 2-hour program. We got a copy of that program, and the students were brilliant, and his answers were absolutely fascinating. And that's something good to say about Richard Nixon coming from me. He was brilliant. But I want to comment on what Richard Brown, who's one of the beauties of New York, his class at the new school on Wednesday night. I teach there on Wednesday nights, too. And I have to fight my way through that auditorium crowd waiting to go in and fill the auditorium to get to my class, which is a fairly large class, but I don't have to fight my way through. And Bert Bedell, who joins me, by the way, Richard, as co-teacher in September, should help fatten that classroom attendance. We should have a very exciting class come Wednesday, September 24th. I want to say this. I travel the city. I ride its buses. I ride its subways. And I see an anger that is deep, that is sharp. I don't condone the actions of some of the people who are angry. Certainly don't condone it, but I recognize it, and it's there. A frustration that is there, and it exists. And what do we do about it? We've got to make conditions better. We have the power to do it. Again, getting back to those tall buildings, those luxurious office buildings, those luxurious apartment buildings, yes, it's great, and it's progress, and it spells success. But we've got to do something for the people who don't have the ability,
What are
who
we
don't
going to do
have
for
the
them, Sid?
opportunities.
Sid, we're going to keep doing things and doing things and doing things. We could tear down the office buildings tomorrow. We could use the same money to go into various underprivileged areas. And 20 years from today, it would be worse than it is today. The fact is that this society will come to terms with itself only when it takes a very harsh look. It understands that poverty cannot per se be eliminated by well-meaning people. Don't misunderstand. The motivation is good. Their hearts are good. Your heart is good. But the fact is, what are you going to do to these people to eliminate the poverty? How are you going to go in and say, here, how much can you finally give away? Finally, the fact is that people in those circumstances need the support, they need encouragement, and they will do it themselves, or it will not be done. Nobody lifts another person out of poverty. It never happens that way. The reason that you have a middle class that will emerge from the poverty is that there are people who are impoverished who say, I've really had it. I'm not going to do it. What are the rules of the game? How do you win in this society? And when you have a group that comes over to this country, a group of immigrants, be they Irish or Italian or Jewish or Oriental, they say, well, this is what you do. You work for a generation, and you take a menial job. It's pretty crummy, and while you're doing that, you put your money aside, and you hope that your kids are going to go through college. And you know from your own background and your parents or your grandparents who perhaps came over here, and they did that, and that wasn't just true of the Jewish community. We see it now. Go out to Flushing, go out to where Barry's got his language club, and you will see, I grew up in Flushing, Sid, but now if you go into Flushing, you see a huge Oriental community. These people have come from Vietnam. They've come from the most horrible situation throughout the 60s, the Vietnamese War. They come from Thailand. There is an enormous Oriental community. And let me tell you something. It's dazzling what these people are doing. That when you go into you go into the science fairs in the city, and all these kids who are winning are terrific. These are kids from China, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam. They are bright, and they are working hard, and in one generation away from parents who couldn't speak the English language. These kids are doing it on their own. They get home, they do enormous amounts of homework, they are industrious, and make no mistake, they are the middle class. They will be the next middle class in the city. But nobody's giving them a darn thing, Sid. Nothing. And if you wanted to start giving them things, you could give them now and next year and 10 years from now. It wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't make it better or worse. They're going to make it on their own, or they will not make it. And I appreciate your sense of conscience and the sense of decency that I know. I've known you for 10 years. I know how you think. But let me tell you something. It doesn't work that way.
Let me just analyze Sid Bernstein as a member of the audience, Richard, and I'll do it in your idiom. I saw all those World War II movies, and I could never believe that those Nazis, Otto Preminger, Erich von Stroheim, Walter Slezak, I could never believe that they were really on our side. I mean, I knew they were with my head, but they were so evil in their portrayal of the enemy that they just convinced me down to the innermost corpuscle. And same thing with the Far East. Who was that? At least I could name the ones who played Nazis. Who was that guy who played the Japanese officer flashing the knife from behind his desk at the American airman who he wanted to reveal where the bases were?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, you could never convince me that guy was on our side. I mean, I had the feeling he came in a Portuguese neutral ship to make a movie in Hollywood and was going back to Tokyo after he made the film. He really was a hated enemy. Sid is merely acting that part right now, not as a Nazi, not as a Japanese warlord. Sid is acting. He doesn't mean we got to do something for these people.
Yes, he does.
He knows that. Come on, did Erich von Stroheim mean we have ways of making you talk? Sid is merely giving me the caricature of the discredited theory.
Wrong. First of all, I want to put in a footnote about Sid.
Why don't we let Sid say if that's what he means or not?
I'm sorry.
Too much fun talking about him.
All right, but
Let me hear what Richard says about Sid.
First of all, this has nothing to do. This is just a footnote, irrelevant to the conversation, but relevant to Sid Bernstein. Sid has a very successful class at the new school, and I am going to take part credit for that class because Sid Bernstein is my protege. Because I started teaching in the new school in 74. In 75, I started a course called The Creative Mind, to get away from films, to not just talk about movies, but to talk about theater and dance and music. And one of my first guests in the first semester I taught that course was Sid Bernstein. And that was 1975, and he came up as my guest, and he sat there and he said, I can't tell you what it means to me to sit in this auditorium. Now we're going back 11 years. He said, because I learned. He said, I used to come here. I studied here. For years I studied in this auditorium, and I heard the great minds of our generation here, and this has been my school, my college, this school, the new school, and this auditorium. He said, to sit on this stage with you there in this auditorium means more to me than I can say. This is a great privilege. And then he proceeded to give us an absolutely sensational class about music, rock music. The whole beginning of the Beatles, as you probably told your listeners, it was Sid who really brought the Beatles to this country and literally started a revolution in music 2 decades ago.
He found 4 poverty-stricken boys from Liverpool and said,
Liverpool.
we got to do something for these people.
And he said, that's right. He said, look, we could give you welfare, sure. I got a better idea. It's the Sid Bernstein self-help program. Now, from that evening, that was one evening, and he was a terrific teacher. Sid in his soul can work with music. He's an entrepreneur, everything, but he's really a teacher. He really has the traditions, the Hebraic traditions of the scholar that runs in his veins. And he got up there and he was sensational. I mean, he was a great teacher. And from that one evening in my class, which was very, very well received, people loved it, and they didn't come to hear about music. They just came because they were interested in communications and art. And some of them had never heard of Sid. They knew the music, but they didn't know Sid. We got into the whole dissection of how the music business functions, and it was terrific. But from that one evening came the whole course. So his course really started after he came and was a major, major star in my class. So I consider him my protege. I don't know how he feels about that. Okay. I feel that there are a lot of people who have a very good soul, and Sid is a very gentle, kind man. I mean, there are things I can talk about later that he has done that have a real sense of kindness and caring and decency, and I can't fault those things. But the reason I take this strong a position is I think a lot of the problems of our city come not just out of meanness and anger and malice, of which we have a great deal in our city. It comes out of well-meaning efforts to understand, to sympathize with, to be considerate of, and to forgive.
Well, New York may not be facing up to its problems, but there's not a single non-New Yorker here, and I think I've heard what sounds like an awful lot of good medicine, maybe even the answer. I'm Barry Farber, and I don't understand why everybody doesn't understand what Richard Brown is trying to tell us. If there were a little puzzle, nice little box with some buttons on it, and you gave one to every kid in the class and told them it had a lot of good stuff in there, and the kids watched how other kids pushed the right buttons and opened that thing, wouldn't you think the ones who hadn't gotten theirs open yet would push those buttons and get theirs open the same way? Education, hard work, putting money aside, raising standards of law and order in your own life, cleanliness. It's such an obvious answer. Why doesn't everybody just copy the successful New Yorkers?
Let me say something. Here's how I feel. Richard has a point of view, and I'm sure most of your listeners share that point of view. Certainly you do, Barry. I hear clearly what he said. The immigrants who come here from Greece, from Italy, from Russia, from Ireland, from England, even from the Orient. But somehow I see it this way. Once your skin is a little darker than those who come from the Orient, it becomes a little more difficult. And this is how I see it. And whether you agree with it or not, this is how I see it. It becomes more difficult. The odds are more stacked. There is a lot of prejudice that exists. There is a lot of discrimination that exists, whether it's conscious or subconscious. When your skin is a little darker, it's that much tougher. And we don't experience it because our skin's not dark. But somehow I see it. I see it in the subways.
Hold the line. We'll get back to that.